My card got declined at a grocery store checkout on a Tuesday afternoon for a total of $31, and the cashier looked at her screen twice before telling me gently that the system was flagging my account as closed due to account holder deceased. I'm Ilsa, 36, and I spend my days investigating fraudulent insurance claims for a living, which meant I recognized the exact shape of what was happening to me roughly 4 minutes before anyone else in that store did. I want to walk you through this the way I'd walk a client through any fraud case, because that's genuinely the only way I got through it myself. I stood at that register with my card in my hand, a line forming behind me, and asked the cashier to run it again. Same result. I paid in cash, apologized to the people waiting, and sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time before I called the bank. The representative on the phone was careful in the way people get when they're about to tell you something they know is going to be hard to hear. She confirmed my account had been flagged and restricted 3 days earlier, following a match against the Social Security Administration's death records. According to federal records, I had died the previous Thursday. I told her I was in fact still alive, sitting in a grocery store parking lot, holding a receipt for $31 of groceries I couldn't currently pay for with my own card. She believed me. My voice matched the account my identity verification cleared instantly, but she also told me something that mattered more than the immediate frustration. A death record like that doesn't appear from nowhere. Somebody somewhere submits documentation. A death certificate usually, filed by a funeral home, a state vital records office, sometimes an insurance company processing a claim. I need you to sit with that phrase for a second, because it's the one that actually started all of this. Somebody had submitted a death certificate with my name on it, and I had absolutely no idea who or why or what they thought they'd get out of it. I remember sitting in that parking lot, repeating the phrase to myself out loud once, just to hear how strange it sounded coming out of my own mouth. Stick with me here, because what I found out over the following 2 weeks kept changing what I thought I understood piece by piece, and none of it turned out to be a mistake. Let me back up a little first, though, because you need to know a bit about my family before any of the rest of this makes sense. Not the polished version, the actual one. The one I'd only half admitted to myself before this whole thing forced me to look at it properly. I grew up in a small town 3 states from where I live now, mostly raised by my mother Delphine, after my biological father left when I was 6. My mother remarried when I was 11 to a man named Garrick, who I never disliked exactly, but never fully trusted, either the kind of stepfather who's perfectly pleasant at holidays and somehow never quite present the rest of the year. I have one half-sibling, my brother Corwin, from that marriage, 12 years younger than me. I moved out of state for college and never really moved back. Not out of any dramatic falling out, just the ordinary drift that happens when a family doesn't have much actively holding it together beyond obligation. I remember growing up, my mother had a particular way of handling money problems, never discussing them openly, just quietly rearranging things behind the scenes, until whatever crisis had been looming simply stopped being mentioned. A car repossessed 1 year got explained away as trading it in for something more practical. A summer where the electricity got shut off for 4 days got folded into a story about a scheduled maintenance outage that somehow lasted exactly as long as the unpaid bill did. I didn't think much of that pattern as a kid. I think about it very differently now. I do fraud investigation work for a regional insurance company, the kind of job where I spend most days pulling apart claims that don't add up, chasing paper trails on staged accidents, inflated property damage, occasionally something darker. I'm good at it. I'm good at it specifically because I know exactly how these systems are supposed to work when someone's telling the truth, which makes it very easy to spot the moment where someone isn't. A few months before any of this started, I'd closed out a case involving a small business owner who'd staged a warehouse fire to collect on inventory that, according to my own audit of his supplier invoices, had never actually existed in the quantities he claimed. It took me 3 weeks of cross-referencing shipping manifests to prove it, and I remember feeling almost satisfied walking my supervisor through the discrepancy, laying out exactly how someone builds a fraudulent claim to look legitimate on its surface. I didn't know yet how useful that exact skill set was about to become in a much more personal context. I didn't call my mother first. I want to be honest about that because it matters. My first instinct wasn't suspicion of my own family. It was the same instinct I bring to any fraud case at work. Rule out the boring explanation before you go looking for the ugly one. Clerical errors happen. Wrong social security number transposed by one digit. A different person entirely sharing my name whose death got misattributed. I called the Social Security Administration's fraud line the next morning and requested the source of the death report. It took 4 days to get an answer, and when it came, it wasn't clerical. The report had come from a state vital records office filed based on a death certificate issued by a funeral home in my hometown, the same town my mother and Garrick still live in. That answered one question and opened up a much bigger one. Someone somewhere in that process had used my actual information, full legal name, date of birth, social security number, to generate a real filed state-recognized death certificate for a person who was very much alive. I need to pause here because I know some of you have had a moment where an institution told you something about your own life that was flatly provably wrong and you had to fight to be believed over a piece of paper. If that's you, I understand exactly how disorienting that is. The specific vertigo of a system trusting a document more than it trusts you standing right in front of it alive and saying so. And what I found out over the following days made it clear this particular piece of paper hadn't appeared by accident. I called the funeral home directly, gave them my name, and asked as calmly as I could manage about a death certificate filed under it. The woman who answered went quiet for a long moment, then asked if I could hold. When the funeral director came on the line, his tone had changed entirely. Careful, clipped, clearly aware something was wrong before I'd even finished explaining. He told me the certificate had been filed based on documentation provided by the deceased's next of kin, along with a physician's pronouncement from a small private clinic I'd never heard of. The next of kin listed was my mother. I sat with that for 2 full days before I called her. I want to tell you honestly what those 2 days looked like because I think it matters. I ran every alternative explanation I could think of, a mix-up with someone else's paperwork, a scam using her name without her knowledge, some bureaucratic tangle that had nothing to do with intent. I've built a career on not accusing anyone of anything until the paper trail actually says it plainly, and this was without question the hardest time I'd ever had holding to that rule. I barely slept either night running scenarios in my head the same way I run them on a case file, except this time, every scenario ended somewhere I didn't want it to. I pulled what public information I could find on the physician's pronouncement. First, the way I'd pull any credential on a fraud case. The clinic listed didn't exist at the address given. The physician's license number, once I cross-referenced it through the state medical board, belonged to a doctor who'd retired 11 years earlier. And according to the board's own records, had died himself 4 years ago. Someone had used a dead doctor's license number to sign off on my death. That's the moment this stopped feeling like an error, and started feeling like something built deliberately by someone who understood exactly which pieces of paperwork nobody usually double-checks. I sat in my car outside the medical board's downtown office for a long while after confirming that name, doing the same kind of mental math I do at work, when a claim's timeline finally clicks into a shape that makes sense. Except this time the shape it made was my own mother's kitchen table, my own name, my own supposed death. I called my cousin Perpetua next, not my mother yet. I still wasn't ready because she's always been the person in that extended family who actually tells me things straight. I asked her carefully if she'd heard anything strange lately involving my mother or Garrick. She hesitated, then told me something I hadn't known. Garrick's construction supply business had filed for bankruptcy protection 8 months earlier, quietly never announced to most of the family. She said my mother had mentioned once in passing something about an old policy finally being useful again, and Perpetua hadn't thought much of it at the time. Perpetua asked me near the end of that call whether I wanted her to say anything to anyone else in the family before I was ready to. I told her no, not yet, that I needed to finish tracing this myself first before it became something the whole family had opinions about. She said she understood, and that whatever I found she'd believe me over any version of events my mother might try to offer instead. I think I needed to hear that more than I let on at the time, someone in that family choosing evidence over loyalty to the person who'd raised us both before I even had the full evidence to show her. An old policy. I felt something cold settle in my chest hearing that phrase repeated back to me. I need to tell you something I hadn't thought about in years until that phone call. When I was 19, my mother had taken out a small life insurance policy on me, the kind parents sometimes do for young adults, listing herself as beneficiary ostensibly to cover funeral costs in case anything happened while I was away at college. I'd forgotten it existed. I certainly never imagined it had grown through decades of compounding and additional riders my mother had apparently kept paying into long after I'd moved out into something worth actually killing a paper version of me over. I pulled the policy records the next day, the same way I'd pull any insurer's file for a client at work, except this time the client was myself, and the insurer had already paid out. $240,000 disbursed 9 days after the fraudulent death certificate was filed to a beneficiary account belonging to my mother. I want you to sit with that number for a second the way I had to. This wasn't a scam targeting a stranger. This was my own mother using my actual identity, a corrupted physician's license, and a bankrupt husband's desperation to collect $250,000 off a policy she'd apparently kept alive for 17 years waiting. It seemed for exactly the moment she'd decide she needed it more than she needed me to know I still existed. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the printed payout confirmation in front of me the same way I'd sit with any client's file, and I remember trying professionally out of habit to imagine what I'd tell a stranger walking in with this exact document. I'd tell them it was one of the cleanest fraud cases I'd ever seen, and one of the ugliest. I called my mother that evening. I didn't tell her what I knew. I just asked casually how she and Garrick were doing, whether everything was all right. Financially, given some things I'd heard through the family. She said everything was fine, better than it had been in a while, actually. She didn't ask why I was asking. I remember that detail specifically, a mother who hadn't heard from her daughter in months, not once asking why the sudden check-in, because some part of her already knew exactly why I might be calling. I drove to my hometown 2 days later on a Thursday, and sat in my rental car outside my mother's house for almost 20 minutes before I went in. I wasn't gathering evidence anymore. I had all the evidence I needed. I think I just needed to see the house, the ordinary, unremarkable house where somebody had apparently decided my death was worth more to them than my life, before I let myself walk through the door. The house looked exactly the way it always had, same porch swing, same faded blue shutters Garrick had promised for years to repaint. I remember noticing a new car in the driveway, nicer than what I'd have expected given everything I now knew about their finances, and I sat there doing quiet math in my head about when exactly that $250,000 had started moving through their lives and what it had already bought before I ever found out it existed. My mother answered, surprised, pleased, in a way that made everything about to happen feel even worse. Garrick was in the kitchen behind her. I didn't sit down. I asked her directly if she knew anything about a life insurance claim filed on my death. She went very still, the specific stillness of someone realizing the version of events they'd built has just run out of road. She didn't deny it right away. She asked instead how I'd found out, which told me most of what I needed before she said anything else. I told her about the checkout line, about the declined card, about tracing the record back through the state, the funeral home, the fraudulent physician's license belonging to a man who'd been dead himself for 4 years. I watched her face change through every stage of it, the same way I've watched 100 fraud subjects' faces change once they understand the paper trail has already caught up to them. Garrick tried to say something from the kitchen doorway, some version of an explanation involving the business, the debt, how close they'd come to losing everything. I told him I wasn't finished talking to my mother yet, and something in my voice must have carried enough weight that he actually stopped and let me continue. She said it had never been meant to hurt me. She said Garrick's business was going to fail completely, that they were going to lose the house, that she'd panicked and remembered the old policy, and told herself somewhere in the panic that I'd never even need to know that the money would fix everything before it ever touched my actual life. I asked her how she'd even found someone willing to falsify a death certificate in the first place, since that wasn't a thing most desperate people would know how to arrange. She was quiet a moment before admitting Garrick had known the funeral director for years. Some old favor between them from before I was born, the kind of relationship built on decades of small, quiet exchanges that apparently made a request like this feel to both of them like just one more favor rather than the felony it actually was. I asked her the question that mattered to me more than the money itself. I asked if she would have ever told me if my card hadn't declined at a grocery store on an ordinary Tuesday. It felt strange asking a question that direct to the person who'd taught me indirectly exactly how to ask direct questions for a living. She didn't answer that one for a long time. When she finally did, she said she genuinely didn't know and that not knowing scared her more than anything else about the entire situation. I filed a formal fraud report the following week, both through the state's insurance fraud division and separately through my own employer's compliance channels, since the conflict of interest required full disclosure the moment I understood what I was actually looking at. I didn't do it out of cruelty. I did it because I've spent my entire career telling clients that paperwork fraud isn't a victimless convenience, and I wasn't going to become the exception to my own rule the one time it happened inside my own family. Filing that report meant sitting across from my own supervisor, a woman named Marisol, who I respect enormously, and explaining professionally, clinically, exactly how my own mother had used a dead physician's license and a corrupted vital records filing to collect on a policy naming me as the deceased. Marisol didn't say much beyond confirming the procedural steps. I think she understood the way good investigators do that there wasn't anything useful she could add to how I was feeling in that moment, only the process itself moving forward the way it was designed to. She did tell me before I left her office that I'd handled the initial investigation more thoroughly than most agents twice my tenure would have, even under circumstances she couldn't imagine surviving herself. I didn't feel proud of that in the moment. I think I do now a little looking back. The delayed part of this story came about 2 weeks later, when Perpetua called me again this time, with something she'd apparently been sitting on since our first conversation, unsure whether it mattered. She said that 4 years earlier, a similar situation had happened with our cousin Thaddeus, a smaller policy, a strange clerical issue with his identity that had resolved itself, or seemed to, before anyone looked closely enough to ask real questions. At the time, everyone had assumed it was simple bureaucratic error. Knowing what she knew now, Perpetua said she wasn't sure anymore that it had been. I called Thaddeus that same day. He remembered the incident, vaguely said it had resolved within a week, and he'd never thought about it again. Some issue with a small policy. His own mother, my aunt, had taken out on him years earlier, flagged briefly for reasons nobody had ever fully explained to him at the time. I told him what I'd found in my own case laid it out the same clinical way I would for any client, and I heard him go quiet on the phone, the same way I imagine I'd sounded to Perpetua days earlier. He said he'd look into the old paperwork himself just to be sure, and asked if I could walk him through exactly what records to request, since apparently my job had just become useful to more of the family than I'd expected. I don't know yet what he'll find. Some part of me suspects it won't be nothing. Garrick's business failed anyway, a few months after everything came out, the fraud filing, making an already precarious situation impossible to hide from creditors any longer. My mother is currently facing charges related to the false claim insurance fraud and identity misuse, the specific details still working through the courts as I record this. I haven't decided yet how involved I want to be in that process beyond providing the documentation I already have. My brother Corwin reached out about a month after everything became public within the family, 24 years old, caught in the middle of a situation he'd had no part in creating. He said he didn't know what to say to me, that he'd grown up with the same mother telling him 100 small versions of the same instinct to smooth things over rather than face them head on, and that some part of him wasn't entirely surprised, even though the specific thing she'd done still felt impossible to fully believe. He asked if I still considered him family, given everything. I told him yes immediately without having to think about it. He'd been a kid in that house the whole time this was unfolding, with no more say in any of it than I'd had in finding out. We talk more now than we did before all this happened, which is a strange, unexpected outcome of the whole thing. one small relationship actually growing stronger out of the wreckage of another one collapsing entirely. I still work fraud cases every day. It's strange, honestly, spending 8 hours tracing exactly the kind of paper trail that led back to my own family, knowing now, in a way I never fully understood before, that the people who commit this kind of fraud aren't always strangers targeting an insurance company from a distance. Sometimes they're the person who raised you, standing in her own kitchen, believing right up until the moment I walked in that a piece of paper could quietly replace the daughter she'd apparently decided was worth more dead on file than alive, and asking questions. I check my accounts differently now, obviously. I've set up alerts I never thought I'd need on my credit, on my identity, on records I used to assume nobody would ever have a reason to touch. I run my own name through the same databases I use for work purposes now every few months, the way you'd check a smoke detector battery. Not because you expect the worst, but because you've learned exactly what it costs not to. I don't know yet what happens with my mother long-term, whether there's a version of this relationship that survives what she did. I don't have a clean answer for that, and I'm not going to pretend I do just to give this a tidier ending than it actually has. Some days I think I could eventually sit in a room with her again. Other days, the thought of it feels like something I'll never fully get back to, and I've stopped trying to predict in advance which version of myself is going to show up on any given day. What I do know is that I'm no longer the daughter who wouldn't have questioned a piece of paper telling me who I was, and some part of me thinks that shift, uncomfortable as it's been, might end up being worth more than the $240,000 ever could have. If any part of this hit close to home, if you've ever had someone you trusted use the systems meant to protect you as the exact tool they used against you, I see you genuinely. I used to think the worst thing fraud could take from someone was money. I know now it can take something quieter and harder to get back the basic assumption that the people closest to you would never file paperwork treating your life as a liability instead of something worth keeping. And if you liked watching someone use exactly the skill nobody expected her to turn on her own family, watch my latest video next. You will not see what she finds there coming either.